Stephanie. Tonight we're going to have a conversation about the election. We're going to talk about what happened. We're going to talk about the polling. We're going to talk about social media and its impact on the race. We're going to talk about millennials and whether millennials showed up to vote as they often have been urged to do. This was a different year, different from many years that we've seen and heard from before. In fact, we've been told it's the election of the angry white male and the angry white female, who ultimately may have said some things differently to pollers and to pollsters that changed ultimately what they thought was going to be the outcome of the election. We've got a distinguished panel of folks from various walks of media that are here to answer questions and to tell you what they think from their perspective and from their expertise. First, I've got Hadass Gold. She is a reporter for Politico.
I have been at Politico since 2012. I'm a relatively still new-ish reporter. I've been a reporter now for about 3 years, although I've been a reporter since I was in high school. One of the things that I cover, the main thing I cover at Politico, is the intersection of media and politics. One of the things that's been obviously really interesting about this election is that the media has almost become the third candidate, that both candidates were seemingly running against at different points in time. In terms of what we need to think about and do after the election, I do think that the media accurately and covered well both candidates, both of their positives and negatives. I think everybody who was watching the news coverage went into a polling booth kind of knowing who these people were and what they were about. You might argue and say, oh, no, well, this person got way more negative press than the other one and it wasn't fair, but you knew who they were and what they were about. And while there have been arguments that the media missed the white voter in the suburbs of Pittsburgh and that we weren't covering them enough, there was coverage of that. And you see that now when you look back at it. It just didn't get as much attention. And I do think that it's not like we were lying or making up the polls that said that Hillary Clinton was ahead. This is what actual, real, objective scientists, including Fox News' own poll, showed that Hillary Clinton was ahead. So clearly, and what I think was happening, and the scientists would have a better idea about this, was that either people weren't picking up their phones, they just didn't want to talk to pollsters. Maybe there was that actual silent majority that Donald Trump always talked about, that there were secret people who were afraid to say that they were Donald Trump supporters. I think another really likely thing is that this election brought out people who hadn't voted before or who used to vote years ago and then stopped voting and now came back. And because pollsters, they try to reach out to who they call likely voters. And those people are people who voted recently. If you haven't voted recently, you might not get a phone call. And so those people turned out to the polls, and that made a big difference. But I'm looking forward to talking to all of you. Please reach out to me online. You can find me on Twitter. My email is hgold@politico.com. It's pretty easy to find. Email me, and I always try to answer everybody.
All right, thanks, Hadass. Next, we have Aaron Katersky. He's an award-winning correspondent for ABC News. He's covered the Arab Spring. Aaron, your thoughts?
So I anchored on the radio for 8.5 hours on election night. And I remember I've gone back to listen, and it was at 9:20 in the evening when the tide shifted. And we started wondering why Virginia hadn't been called. We started wondering about all these states. And then we sensed a mood shift in the campaigns. And I remember tossing to our reporters at each of the campaigns, and the euphoria at the Clinton camp had died down to silence, and suddenly Trump supporters started drinking. And they wheeled in champagne because there was happiness in the land of Donald Trump, which was in a ballroom at the Hilton about the size of this stage. The Trump campaign did not see this coming. For all the science that was wrong, the RNC and the DNC had the same polling as the press. And so the Trump campaign had prepared a party that was literally for 4 people who were going to be, hey, make America great. And then that was it. And then it got bigger. And then we were on until 3:30 in the morning to declare Donald Trump the next president. So psyched to join you all, and thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Next, we have Brian Caravellano. Did I say that right, Brian?
Yes, perfect.
He's Vice President for News at AP U.S. Operations in New York. Brian, your take on it.
I was in the AP Washington Bureau on election night, and one of the things that we do at the AP, which probably not a lot of people outside the media know about, is we call the races. So the networks call most of the big elections, the big cable news channels, but with those exceptions, pretty much the rest of the media organizations in the country rely on the AP to call the races. And it's a fascinating thing to watch all of this data come in and this kind of, many years of knowledge and how to read that, and the vote coming in from different counties, and it's looking a little soft over here, we need some more data over here, and to watch that process and to watch as it rapidly became clear that night of what was going to happen, which really, let's be honest, it defied our expectations too, because we were all looking at the same polling data in the run-up to the election. And to see the business-like professional approach of my colleagues to just sort of pivot and keep going, and I think this happened in newsrooms across the country on that night, was a thing of beauty to watch, and really kind of drove home to me the importance of what we do, which I think in the next 4 years is going to be more important than ever. And as I was saying to Aaron earlier, it kind of feels like when we're wanted least, we're needed most. And the efforts that you may have been reading about in the past week or so to kind of, the media is trying to figure out how do we cover this administration or this administration to be. And it's clear that access is going to be very difficult, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to aggressively cover the Trump administration. We're going to hold them accountable because that's what we do. We're going to be fair, but we're going to be tough, but I think it's going to be very challenging, but certainly not boring next 4 years.
Am I reading this right? Ben, it says Ben Muskowitz, the technologist and instigator. Is that correct? who teaches at the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and also is a visiting associate arts professor at NYU Shanghai. What's an instigator? What is that about?
That's my cop-out and my spin for not actually being a journalist or having anything credible to say. So I hope you take everything I say with a grain of salt, because I'm not a reporter, I'm not an editor, I don't work in the news biz. So there's your instigation.
Lucky you.
So I think what I can bring to our conversation tonight is a different perspective. It's more of a technology perspective. I have been working in technology and really on the technologies that make the web work. I worked for Mozilla for a long time, which is the company that makes Firefox, the web browser. I've been involved in web standards, but I've also just been interested in a student of how people get their information and how that's changed. And that's a really cliche sort of area to be thinking and talking about. How has the media changed? How has the internet changed the way we get information? But I think that what just happened is so interesting, and if there were ever a time to really have a serious conversation about that, it's now. There's a lot of reasons that Donald Trump succeeded where other candidates like him failed. So you could argue that Trump has a lot in common with like the Michelle Bachmans and the Herman Cains, the candidates who really encouraged distrust of the media, who really spoke to almost a fringe mentality and like a deep distrust of institutions. And one reason I think that Trump succeeded where some of those other candidates failed is because he was able to rally and to consolidate a lot of fringe and alternative media, not just conservative talk radio, but also the likes of Alex Jones from InfoWars, the conspiracy theory guy, right? Also, Breitbart. There's a question to be asked about whether Trump leveraged Breitbart or Breitbart leveraged Trump. But there is something to be said about how he was able to consolidate a lot of strange fringe channels to people and speak to people directly, and also through Twitter. He can speak to people without being intermediated. And I think that's really interesting. But there's one other thing about Donald Trump that I think we should look at and acknowledge, which we did earlier before this panel, which was before he even threw his hat into the ring 15 months ago, he already had 24 million fans who watched him every night on television. And that is something that we need to reckon with, because when we think of the media and we think of the omnipresent channels that are really setting the narratives and are giving people their ways of understanding what's happening in the world, cable news is infinitesimally tiny. On a good night, 1 million people might be watching cable news. Facebook is everywhere. There are billions, no exaggeration, of Facebook accounts. Every American is on Facebook. I think that's a fair generalization to make. And so the idea that we can continue to have a fact-based conversation, or that we will continue to have referees of what is true and what is happening is something that unfortunately I think we're going to need to evaluate. And that's impossibly big, but we have 90 minutes to riff on that. So let's have fun.
I think Ben touched on all of the third rails that has been this presidential election this year. But I want to go back to the broader theme and then narrow down, and I'll put this question to the panel in general. What happened? What the hell happened? So when you think about the polling, right here at Monmouth University, Patrick Murray has a very respected polling institute that was used as a rubric for determining how people were going to vote in the election. The Monmouth Polling Institute was cited by every major news organization in the country. And I believe in its last poll, Hillary was up by 4 or 5 points. So they were wrong. And so was 538. And so was Gallup. And so was Real Clear aggregate of polls. The only one I believe that was remotely close was the LA Times poll.
There was also an IBD poll.
Yeah, something
That may have been close. But the bottom line is the pollsters missed the sentiment in this country that said it overwhelmingly wanted Donald Trump to be president. So what happened? Women voters who supposedly were upset by comments that Mr. Trump had made weren't going to vote for him. Democrats who love Hillary Clinton in working class neighborhoods weren't going to vote for him. Blacks in the inner city who they said he'd spoken down to them or made really inappropriate comments weren't going to vote for him. Yet if you look at the metrics in practically every category, he made sizable gains and even in some instances did better than Mitt Romney in the previous election. So I'm going to start with Hadass. What happened from your perspective? So we're going to mix it up. Hadass.
I think I talked about some of the polling in my introductory answer, and I'm not a pollster, so I can't talk about their methods and what they got right or wrong. But I think there is an element in the media really focuses on the horse race and focuses on what the polls and the data tell them. We really like data. And there was an interesting anecdote. I did a profile of this one journalist who lives outside of Pittsburgh, almost near the border of Ohio. Her name is Selena Zito. She had worked at the Pittsburgh Tribune for 11 years, and she recently got laid off and started freelancing for major magazines like The Atlantic or The New York Post or anything like that. And she kept writing all these pieces about how Trump was on the path pretty much to victory. And what she had done is she had outlined 10 counties in Pennsylvania that she thought Trump needed to flip in order to win, and to notice that were trending Republican over the past few years, but had still normally voted for a Democratic president. And she went and visited them. She got into her car and she put more than 70,000 miles on her car in the past year and a half or so, and she talked to these people, and she lives in these environments and she sees them. Granted, all of her stories were anecdotal, and she was mocked for writing these anecdotal pieces about a bar full of Pittsburgh suburban people who were won over by Donald Trump. People were saying, okay, fine, you found 10 people who are going to vote for him, great. But she tapped into something, and there is something to say about this kind of anecdotal evidence. Sometimes people get made fun of for driving around and counting who has signs up, and and people say, well, the signs don't translate into votes. The number of people at your rallies don't translate into votes, and that's true. But there is something for kind of the momentum feeling. And I think there was an element in the media focusing so much. You mentioned 538. 538 doesn't do their own polling. What they do is they look at everybody else's polling and run some numbers and tries to figure out how everybody feels. That hasn't failed us before. It failed us now. But I would keep in mind that in the primaries, the polls showed that Donald Trump was leading, and they were right. So it's not like this. What I'm saying is this is a new phenomenon. And I think that a lot of media are probably rightly thinking, how do we get out there and how do we talk to these voters that we missed?
Did people lie to the pollsters?
Maybe, but we can't tell. I'm sure also people didn't pick up their phones. I'm sure people also told them they didn't know or they didn't want to say who they voted for.
Or they said they were going to vote and they didn't actually come out and vote.
Exactly. What was it, like half the protesters out of an Oregon protest weren't even registered to vote or didn't vote or something like that?
We're not all awful because we did get the percentages right. We knew who was voting. We knew that 17% were undereducated, white males who, live in yellow houses or whatever that is. We didn't pick up on the intensity, both for Donald Trump and against Hillary Clinton, because there were a lot of Democrats who I think were taken for granted. And the intensity of the dislike for Hillary Clinton, I think we missed. And there's only two slogans in politics. Either it's time for a change or you never had it so good. And it was always going to be a tall order for Clinton. And I think the people, whatever they are, I don't think they were all angry, and I don't think they certainly weren't all white, and they weren't all dumb. That was a big component of Trump's support, but
Picked up 26% of the Latino vote.
yeah, I mean, there was, he had a cross-section of support who did not care about grabbing women by any part or anything like that. They just weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton under any circumstance.
Brian, what about the AP? You guys did some really hard-hitting stories on Hillary Clinton. She pushed back on some issues related to the foundation and folks that she had visited with related to the foundation. Do you think the Comey emails had an impact on whether or not voters were discouraged with the Comey letter about the emails, had an impact and were discouraged to come to the polls to support her?
I don't think we know that for sure, but there's some strong evidence, and she certainly believes that. She came out over the weekend. Her first statement was basically blaming the loss on James Comey. And it is true that on the day that Comey first popped up and said, we're going to look at these emails again, about 20 million people had voted at that point, and another 24 million voted in the week before he came back and said, we looked at the emails and there's nothing there. So it's hard to imagine that the people who voted during that period weren't somehow influenced by the outcome. Whether it influenced the people who voted on Election Day, it's kind of hard to know. And I think what we need to be careful here about thinking about what happened is we don't actually know, right? We only know based on exit polls. The exit polls this year were more flawed than ever. I mean, we don't really know that 26% of Latinos voted for Donald Trump. We just know that exit polls, which in some cases, in some states were conducted in as few as 5 polling places, which is not a representative sample. And I think, you know, is there anyone here from the Polling Institute? Because I'm about to say something that might upset them. Polling is a
Is
dark...
Patrick here? Patrick's not here? Okay, good, let's talk about him.
Yeah. Polling is a dark art, and polling has gone through its own set of disruptions because of mobile technology, and they haven't yet figured out how to account for the fact that they can't just call you on your home phone anymore. And so polls are now conducted in a variety of different ways. There's online panels, they call them, where they convene a group of people that's sort of a static group, and they ask them the same questions over and over again and see how they react to it. They do, you know, sort of automatic, you know, mobile polling. There's, you know, Survey Monkey's trying a whole bunch of stuff. These averages that 538 and the New York Times and others do, it's just an average of all of those polls. But every single one of those polls is flawed, and those flaws are reflected in something called the margin of error that everybody always forgets about. If you take an average of polls and they have an average margin of error of 3 to 4%, that average still is subject to the margin of error. And so if you looked at some of the states that were blue on 538's map and looked at the actual average, it was 0.6% in the case of Florida, I think, the day before the election. It was 0.8% in New Hampshire, and that is well within the margin of error. So I'm hardly defending the dark art of polling here, except to say that they didn't totally get it wrong. I mean, if a state that showed a 0.6% polling average went the other way, it was still within the margin of error. They actually had that right by their own definition. And they're still kind of casting about for how do you do polling in an era where everybody's on a mobile phone and has caller ID and probably isn't going to answer the phone when you want to ask them a set of questions. And I think we're a long way from figuring out a lot of that stuff.
Isn't it also a flaw of interpretation, too? Because the purpose of polls is not to tell you who wins. The purpose of polls is to tell you why people vote.
Yeah.
And that's often an imprecise science or art.
Yeah, and I think it becomes less precise with each election. I think those of us who do this for a living, we went into this election knowing that, and yet we all went down the pipe with it anyway. And I think that's a big part of the answer of what happened, but I think a lot of the answers are still to come until we really see who voted where and for what, and that data is not available yet. I mean, any conclusions are based on exit polls.
Ben, in the earlier session, we talked about the impact of social media. What role do you think social media played in the outcome of the election?
That's a very large question, but before I field some thoughts, I think that you made a good point, which is that when all the votes are tallied, Clinton may well be 1 million up in the popular vote, which would mean that the national polls were right.
We're pretty close, yeah.
What happened, arguably, is that in the upper Midwest, and however you want to describe that region, turnout for Clinton was down. Now, given that, and this will get us into the social media thing, I think there's actually some very simple observations that can explain what happened. Donald Trump is a TV celebrity. He's a TV celebrity who had 24 million people a night every week watching him on The Apprentice. No other politician has that. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing is he had a message. I mean, what does Donald Trump stand for, right? Make America great again, build the wall, drain the swamp, right? Those are, like him or not, I mean, that's the message. What was Hillary Clinton's message? No, but really, what was it, right?
I'm with her.
There's I'm with her, okay. It's about her, not about me. Stronger together, which is like almost meaningless. Her logo looked like a corporate healthcare logo. And I think they made some fundamental errors in communications. They were also fielding a slogan, love trumps hate, right? Love trumps hate. So, you could say, okay, yeah, let's make the campaign about him. Let's make a referendum about him. That's not a substitute for a message. But also, love trumps hate in a weird subliminal way is encouraging you to love Trump's hate. It's just bad messaging. Right. So, I mean, what we can do is have a big conversation about how we were all wrong and epistemologically we have a crisis and we didn't see it. But I think there's some more simple, sort of black swanish explanations that we can field. That Donald Trump is a celebrity and the Clinton campaign had a weak message. That said, and I know we want to move on, social media is a major, major, major factor here. And not just social media, but the internet. Breitbart News was getting more traffic than almost any traditional news or opinion site. And the bounds of acceptability on Breitbart are not like anything we've ever seen. What's okay on Breitbart could shut down a newspaper 10 years ago.
Or get you kicked out of school now.
Or get you kicked out of school now, which is an interesting cultural thing that we might need to contend with. But the fact that Breitbart is ascendant, and the fact that Trump really went to what we traditionally consider fringe news outlets. I talked about Alex Jones. Alex Jones is a guy who thinks that Sandy Hook was a fake federal conspiracy, that there are planes putting chemicals in the air so that the people will stay docile, that 9/11 was an inside job, and it's huge. It's huge. Google it if you haven't heard of the guy. Alex Jones is huge. He's got millions of followers, and Donald Trump is the only candidate who called into the show, and supposedly he's going to call the InfoWars show to thank them for their support in putting him. So something about Donald Trump and his willingness to go to fringe media and to rally fringe media online and the whole alt-right phenomenon that we sometimes talk about, that's the real social media story, is the alt-right. And I think that we need to continue interrogating what that is and what it means going forward.
I want to open it up to the audience. Questions from any folks out here about what you think. Jim.
I'd like to follow up on what both Hadass and Aaron mentioned a moment ago about your colleague who visited the bars in Ohio and found Trump supporters where no one else would believe her. And Aaron, Trump's inappropriate comments about race, misogynistic comments, it's been postulated that Trump supporters, particularly in those blue-collar Midwestern states, cared nothing about that, cared nothing about what he had to say regarding those issues, and the only thing they cared about was they've suffered economically for years and years and years, and they didn't care about anything else but that, and they felt it was only Trump who could help them out of this hole, and nothing else mattered. Do you find that to be true?
It's not an original thought on my part, but we took him literally but not seriously, and it's been said that his supporters took him, seriously but not literally.
Selena wrote that.
Yeah. So I think there's probably some truth there, and we think words matter, but if you're plugged into Alex Jones and you've created your own Facebook echo chamber and that's all you see, you don't think certain words matter or facts matter. So we had a hard time playing. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. We
and
just weren't equipped.
that then begs the question: why did you bring a knife to the gunfight? Why did the media miss that?
I don't know if we missed it or if we just couldn't. We weren't playing the same game. If we're playing a fact-based game and things that are coming up on the campaign trail that aren't based on facts, we don't have anything, and I say that as a radio guy who has to distill things into 20 and 30 seconds, which is still an eternity longer than 140 characters. I just don't know that we kept pace.
I think we're talking about two different things too, though. I mean, the economic factors that led people to Trump is different from the coverage of the campaign and the politics and the racehorse part of the coverage. I actually think the media has done, maybe it was a little late to the game, but has done a very good job getting out into communities. I mean, the work that I'm most proud of AP journalists doing this year was getting out into communities and exploring the reasons why people were driven to that message. And they were largely economic. And I don't think you should ever underestimate the importance of economic factors and how they drive people to vote. That people are willing to overlook a lot of flaws in a candidate if they feel that person's going to help them economically. I think what's strange is that Donald Trump, of all people, became the vessel for that hope. You know,
A guy literally sitting on a golden throne on his first interview after being elected.
Right.
I mean, literally, 60 Minutes interview. It's him and his family sitting on golden thrones, and they're, that's gonna. But I want to just add one thing quickly. I think we like stories that explain complex things, and that's a flaw in the coverage, right? We had stories and myths that we really believed in, and now we're going to begin historical revisionism of the last week and the last 15 months. Let's just look at the data to understand what's happening in the country. It's not as if there was a huge populist uprising like we keep hearing, because voter turnout was down over last election and the one before it. Okay, so I think that we need to not fall into this trap of saying the country just wanted change and the country really desperately wanted something new. That may be what motivated those that came out, but as an absolute matter, less people voted than 4 years ago, and way less people voted than 4 years before that. So I think.
What about millennials, though? Why didn't millennials turn out for Hillary Clinton the way she thought they would have?
2 words. Anodyne message. Anodyne message. What did she stand for? She stood against Donald Trump. She often stood back and didn't campaign to let him immolate in public, and they thought that would work. It didn't. She needed to have a message, and she didn't.
Hi, guys. As a millennial, I think something that like a lot of students faced and a lot of younger new voters faced is because this huge idea of, I'm going to vote for Trump, and then you have all these people saying, you're going to vote for a sexist, misogynistic, this horrible guy, and then it's like, okay, well, I'm going to vote for Hillary, and they're like, oh my God, you're going to vote for a liar, and where do those emails go, and all this stuff, and then it's like, well, you know what, I'm not voting. Everyone's like, you don't care about this country. You don't want to say, you're not exercising your right as someone who's able to vote, and I think never before in an election has something like that ever happened where you've been swayed. No matter which way you go, it's negative. There was never any positivity concerning anything. And I thought it was very interesting how you brought up Hillary's messages and how they were all just against Trump. She didn't really put anything forth that was, well, this is why you should vote for me and not him. It was all, don't do him, don't do him, don't do him. And I think just as someone who didn't vote, because I'm from New York and I didn't get an absentee ballot in time. I kind of wanted to touch on that. I think a big problem with millennials is a lot of people are in colleges and universities and they don't have the ability to vote because they're not in their state. And I wanted to know what your thought was on that, how it weighs in on an election, and if an absentee ballot doesn't come in time, and the value of an absentee ballot, and when it gets played into voting, like how it all kind of plays into the grand scheme of things.
If you were passionate about your candidate, you would have found a way to get a ballot.
Very true.
Or you would have driven home
Or you would have
for that day, or, I mean,
Also, there's classes, and like we didn't have all the classes that can just like leave to go.
yeah, I mean, and that's something everybody deals with on election day. There are people, the New York Times had like a game where you could be like a middle class minority voter who does a shift job, and you're like, as you're trying to get to the polls and vote, your boss starts calling you and yelling at you, and you start losing money, and you're like, oh my God, and then eventually you get out of line because you just don't want to sit there and vote. But that's true. I'm sure that in 2008, there were a lot of voters like you who were so excited about Barack Obama that they got their absentee ballot months beforehand, just so that they knew that they could vote. And you didn't do that because you weren't that excited. When your favorite band comes to town, you know when the tickets are going to go on sale, right? And you're sitting there waiting at your computer just so you can click buy and you can make sure you get that ticket. And that's how sometimes people feel about their candidates. And you clearly, I mean, if it's a band you don't care about, you're going to maybe pop online the day before, see, are there tickets available? Or they're not, okay, there's no tickets, it's fine. And so you were like, okay, fine, my absentee ballot, I didn't get it, it's okay, not a big deal. And it's that passion. I always say to people, they say, well, millennials and women and all these, they can't stand Trump, they're not going to vote for her. It is a lot easier to get yourself up and out of bed for something you are excited for and you're excited to attend, rather than something you're scared of or something that you don't like. You are much more excited to get up and go to that concert rather than to go to your yearly dentist appointment. And that's really where it comes down to.
What drove the passion then for the Trump supporters? Because they turned out in droves, his rallies. I remember reading and seeing on television where they said, oh, the rally support doesn't mean anything. Just because there are 10,000 people at the rally, that's not going to translate into votes. Obviously it did, but what about that, the enthusiasm of the Trump voter? Clearly they went to the polls in big numbers and they brought their friends and family with them.
Well, because, I mean, it is true that rallies don't always translate into votes. And I remember talking to Mitt Romney staffers who said, we were convinced we were going to win because our last couple of days we literally had 30,000 people rallies. And Trump often lied about his crowd numbers. He would say they had 20,000 people in his crowds, and we would talk to the fire marshal and they'd have like 4,300. So he would build up this idea that he was getting 20,000 people at every single rally. Sure, he had raucous rallies. They were very exciting, and they were events. I went to some of them, and it was like going to a carnival, and they had free barbecue outside, and like it was a whole fun thing. You'd go to a Hillary Clinton event, and it would be a very serious town hall where she'd be talking about how she was going to combat climate change and what to do about Mary and her mom who lost their health care or something like that. That's not as fun as going to these events. He's a celebrity, as Ben said, and it's exciting to go see him. And I think that did translate into people getting excited about him, and people were perhaps excited about Hillary Clinton, but not in the same way.
But man, he didn't take advantage of it at all. You never saw anybody signing people up at a Trump rally or there to get your address. If you even got near the door at a Hillary Clinton rally, the DNC had your name, your number, your daughter's name, your kid's name. They knew like where you lived and whether you had voted 12 years ago, 8 years ago, and still, but
They still lost.
But they still lost because she never had an affirmative message. You always vote for something. John Kerry found out the same thing in 2004 when, he was the guy who was going to stop the guy who brought us all into Iraq, and then that didn't really sort out either because he never had anything to give people to hang on to.
We're blaming all of this, though, on Hillary Clinton and her campaign, which they certainly deserve a share of the blame, but low voter turnout has been a Republican strategy in swing states for a generation now, and it was very successful in this case. And the Democrats did not turn out their base, which includes black people, Hispanics, union members. They didn't come out, or they didn't come out for Clinton, and they either came out for Trump or they didn't vote at all. I think her question and what Ben was touching on is a really important thing to keep in mind, which is that among the total pool of U.S. voters, something a little less than a quarter of them voted for Donald Trump, a little more than a quarter of them voted for Hillary Clinton, and the rest didn't vote at all, right? And those who didn't vote at all is a big part of the story here.
How is WikiLeaks, how is that even allowed? And media covering that, and then all of a sudden, this whole thing came in, and then they had the week off, and then she got hit again. And then it's like nothing ever came of it. What's going on now? Now you don't even hear anything in the media. Nothing, right? The second the election's done, it's over.
Dude,
and now,
I'm tired.
What's that?
I'm tired.
No, I know, but I think that totally, completely derailed her. Absolutely derailed her. I know you said that would be really, really tough to prove, but I think that absolutely had a big part of it.
I would love to talk about WikiLeaks just for a second, if we can. One of the most ironic and remarkable things about the role that WikiLeaks played this time is that when Hillary Clinton was running the State Department, she introduced this idea of the Internet Freedom Agenda. And the idea was that all of the authoritarian countries in the world, we were going to go in and encourage sort of a free and open information sphere. We were going to encourage platforms like Facebook and Twitter, just generally a free and open internet, because the theory was that that's how you democratize and that's how you open up the society. So that was a stated feature of American foreign policy. And a lot of nations, the Russians, the Chinese, were both offended and threatened by that because they saw it as a form of American, imperialism, for lack of a better word. the great irony is that Hillary was the main champion of that. And in some ways, the prescription that she made for the rest of the world came back to bite her in a big way, because it's through the freedom of internet, which I think is a great thing. I mean, I think it's the best thing. But the Russians, in a sense, and I do think there's plenty of evidence that Russian-affiliated actors supplied the information to WikiLeaks. Doesn't mean that they're coordinating, but somebody fished the information out and gave it to them, right? And I think that there's plenty of evidence, there's a preponderance of evidence to suggest that this was a form of strategic exploitation, and almost, you want to see what internet freedom looks like? And so I think that's part of the story. There's more. There's also the role of bots. Now, when you look on Twitter and you see someone's face and their 140 character bio, I like food, I like bikes, I'm a cat lover. I have 300 followers and I'm following 100 people. There's actually software to go and create sock puppets, fake people, right? Fake pictures, fake bios, fake tweets. They pass the test of whether you can tell it's a human or not. And there's also been plenty of journalism from this cycle to show that a lot of the hashtags, the MAGA, the hashtag Make America Great Again, hashtag, a lot of bots. And a lot of these bots, there's evidence tracing them back to Romania, right? And so that's a part of the story as well. As we enter into the social media world, the crowd, the mob, how do you know that it's authentic or genuine? And I don't even think we've begun to imagine how we talk about that and bring it from where it is now, just sort of a niche thing that not a lot of people are thinking about and understanding, to what it really should be, right? Which is, how do we have good journalism? How do we have good civic debate in light of all that? And I think there's a lot to talk about there.
I want to move on and talk about a couple of other things similar to that too, with respect to trust and qualifications. We haven't talked much about that tonight. Lots of folks had issues with the trust factor with Hillary, and it was amplified with the issue with the emails. And there was also the separate component of qualifications. There were no concerns about whether she was qualified or not. I think exit polls showed that 63% of the folks who had voted said that she was qualified to be president, and I think 61% said that Trump was not. Yet, they still voted for him. So it's an interesting dynamic there with respect, Brian, to how does that happen? How can you say you don't trust someone but they're qualified, and yet the other guy that ends up winning, you have issues of trust with him as well, and say in the exit polling that he's not qualified and he ends up becoming the next president?
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. I mean, one is this, this really scary trend in which facts don't seem to matter as much to people as they used to, and I think that's frightening not only for us as journalists, but I think it should be scary for everyone, because a fact-based debate is really the foundation of our democracy, and it seems to have kind of gone out the window here. But I think it also shows that people voted on other issues. You might have said, I know he's been accused of sexual assault. I know he has loose control of the facts. I know he's got all these other liabilities. But I'm still going to vote for him because at least he's not more of the same, and the same has not worked out for me and my family and my community. And I think it shows again that a lot of these factors were largely economic, and people were willing to overlook what they saw as the shortcomings of either candidate and cast a vote based on those factors, which, it doesn't make for great cable news debate to sit there and debate the homeless, or the jobless rate in Kentucky. But that actually has more to do with how people vote than a lot of the things that we do spend a lot of time talking about.
So the lack of facts, Hadas, got in the way of a good story, and Trump had a good story to tell and didn't have a lot of facts to back that up.
I mean, maybe for some voters, but not for the media. I think the media was covering him and who he was. But I think if you think about it this way, if a lot of the people were voting because of economic anxiety, because they were worried that their children and their grandchildren were not going to have as good of a life as they had because they lost their factory job, or their town was falling into disrepair, they cared less about the fact that Hillary Clinton would be a calming force on the international stage, that she knew how to handle Vladimir Putin. What they cared more about was that they knew that Donald Trump knew how to build businesses and build buildings, and he made lots of money, and that's what he did. And they wanted him to do that for their towns. They could care less whether Germany is worried about U.S. pulling out of NATO. And while that could affect their day-to-day lives when you think about the markets and trade and whatnot, what they wanted Donald Trump to do was to bring back, what he said, make America great again, bring back this glory. They see him, and I disagree with this, how could they vote for the guy in the golden throne? Because they wanted that golden throne to come to their communities. They wanted to feel like they wanted to be like him and be a businessman like him, and whether or not he came from money already. Like he obviously didn't build this business from scratch. He got money to start with, but they didn't care about that because they saw that he went in and he was always coming up with something new. We mocked Trump vodka and Trump steaks and everything that fell apart and they all went bankrupt. They probably saw it and say like, oh well, that was a great idea. Oh well, like did you see all that stuff that he came up with and he built and he did, and he was always out there putting his name on everything. That shows to them that he can build things and he can make things, and that's what they need in their communities.
There was this, just by way of anecdote, I think you're onto something, and forgive, I forgot where we are, but there was something Daddy Warbucks about it. When people it just came to me. I don't know if you caught this, but at Trump rallies, women would come dressed up.
Oh yeah.
In
glitter dresses.
And guys would, for all the Make America Great Again hats and all that, guys would come dressed to meet the billionaire, or I'm not sure he's a billionaire, facts are still out, but to meet him, and there was something about having that rub off. I don't know when it's ever been true that if you give the boss all the money and the power, he's going to make your life better. I'm not sure that's ever been true in this country, but there was, I think, a real yearning that people saw something in him aspirational that they definitely didn't see in her.
So, I think that what's hugely important now is where we go from here, because a lot of people voted based on a belief that something was going to come to them. Candidates make promises to voters. Our job is to hold them accountable for those promises. We need to go back to those communities, which is not, always the sexiest work of journalism. We need to go back to those communities and find out what happens over the next 4 years. Does the coal mine reopen and all of the jobs come back? Doubtful. I mean, I hope it does. But we need to go do that. And that's really, really the most important work that we do as journalists more than anything else. And I think a commitment from news organizations to do that is really important. And whether or not voters end up caring about it or not, it's our obligation, and that's what we're supposed to do. And now is the time that we have to start kind of making that pivot and thinking about how we're going to do that.
I just had a question about branding. I teach in the graphic design department, and we talk about branding a lot. And I think you had a really great point about the Trump steaks and the Trump vodka. And I was just struggling with that and thinking about, what does the Trump brand stand for? What does the Clinton brand stand for? And I was just hashing this over in my mind over the past week. And I was just wondering if you guys had a comment about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I clearly Trump has a very effective brand, and it worked out really well. And as I'm sitting here thinking, as we're talking about, I wonder how much a lot of voters actually knew about all these things we're talking about, right? Because a lot of these are issues that came up during the primary when, I think a very small number of voters are actually engaged. Engagement, as we know, turned out to be lower. And it's very easy in this bubble that we all live in, and I include both academic and media as part of that bubble, to think that there's a higher level of engagement in information and in politics than there actually turns out to be. And it may be that the Trump brand trumps all of that stuff, right? Whether or not Trump Steaks ended up going bankrupt or Trump University ends up getting sued for allegedly misleading people may be less important than the fact that people just know Trump and they know The Apprentice and they know the sort of gilded reputation of what Trump stands for, and the rest of it is all kind of just background noise.
So in addition to Trump having the celebrity status and having the branding, how much do you think, in terms of voter turnout, people being ambivalent toward both of the candidates hurt Hillary Clinton, in the sense that a lot of millennials were very pro Bernie Sanders, and then he ended up not being the candidate, and people felt like they had to choose between the lesser of two evils. and they didn't want to have to make that choice. Like, that was a difficult decision for people to make. How much do you think that affected the outcome of the election?
Well, turnout and enthusiasm is usually how you can tell who's going to win. And we saw from the young lady over here that, I mean, she didn't turn on her absentee ballot because there was, maybe, sorry? No, I'm just using, but I don't mean to call you out. I'm using you as an example, and I know plenty of my friends who just didn't go and vote because or when they voted for, they left it blank, or they voted for their friend for president. They wrote in somebody, right? And still they're complaining on Facebook. I can't believe that Donald Trump is our president. I'm like, okay, well, did you vote? Who did you vote for? And I'm not trying to knock them and say that you made the wrong decision if you're complaining about this. That's totally fine. I think what the key is here is that a lot of people only start paying attention when there's two candidates. And where the real power lies is in the primaries. And that's where things are decided. If you were unhappy that Hillary Clinton was the nominee, or you were unhappy that Donald Trump was the nominee, then maybe if more people got involved in the primaries, because if you actually go down into the numbers and figure out how many people voted for Donald Trump and that made him the nominee, or how many people voted for Hillary Clinton and that made her the nominee, and I know that there's a whole superdelegate thing, it is a lot smaller group than people are probably thinking. It's not like the whole country got together and voted and said, I think we're going to vote for these two people. Because if the whole country voted and chose two candidates, we'd see a different outcome. We see this in states that have open primaries, or open, where you end up with two Democrats on the ballot in the general election, or two Republicans on the ballot in the general election. And I think that's, if you're frustrated by the process, if you want people to get more enthusiastic, the problem is that you got to get enthusiastic like 2 years before, and that we live in a two-party system. Maybe that will change after this. I don't know.
And move to Des Moines.
Yes.
But she was hurt by the ambivalence, I think.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
There's some growing evidence that a disliked woman will be more disliked than the disliked guy. And I think there's some neat research being done now as to how and to what extent that's true.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a question about endorsement. So this is an endorsement question. Any impact or influence from press endorsements, meaning newspapers, magazines, is that a factor anymore? And then what happened with celebrity endorsements? What was the impact or role of endorsements among celebrities on either side? Is that anything that people even pay attention to anymore? Is that
Well, there's some pretty strong evidence from this election that they don't, right? Because the overwhelming number of endorsements went to Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, and I think Gary Johnson even enjoyed more endorsements than Donald Trump, and yet
I think
he
there were
still won the
only
election.
2 newspapers in the country, one of them owned by a supporter of Donald Trump, that actually endorsed Donald Trump in the presidential. Conservative-leaning newspapers also did not endorse, but obviously that didn't make a difference, right?
Yep. The celebrity endorsements, I guess you could say the same thing, because an overwhelming number of celebrities came out and campaigned. I mean, the night before the election, Hillary Clinton's hanging out with Bruce Springsteen and Lady Gaga, and it's like this endless parade of celebrities. And again,
Only one celebrity mattered.
she may only really be speaking to her base, and those are people who are going to vote for her anyway.
I want to shift gears and do a couple of things in the last half of this talk today. One of them is to kind of talk about what are the positive attributes that we see in the president-elect, and then also talk about his cabinet in the future. I think maybe Brian talked about going back and looking at some communities that voted for Donald Trump. What does it mean in terms of his cabinet? We know that he's appointed Steve Bannon as his chief of staff. Are you guys familiar with Breitbart News? Bannon ran Breitbart. It's an alt-right publication. It celebrates lots of alternative viewpoints. You find stories, I'm being nice. You might find stories celebrating the Confederate flag. This is the site that gave rise to the Obama being born in Kenya and not in the USA. So it's a very right-leaning publication, and the guy who ran that publication has been appointed chief of staff.
Not chief of staff.
Chief of
I'm
staff,
sorry,
yeah.
special advisor
Yeah.
to Donald Trump. which is a high-level position. When you look at Supreme Court appointments and you look at Roe v. Wade and you look at some really serious laws that are coming before the Supreme Court, what will the Trump presidency mean for a lot of these issues that people said was the most consequential election in recent history? Let's talk about that and the impact of the Trump presidency on, say, the Supreme Court, Hadass.
Well, he has laid out the list of people that he will be appointing to the Supreme Court, and they were pretty much taken directly from some very conservative groups. And I think that he will stay true to that list. I think that Donald Trump is somebody that relies a lot on the advice of people that he respects and trusts. He's constantly on the phone with people. He's talking to people. Even when you're interviewing him, he'll ask you, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Did you see that? Wasn't that great? And so he will rely on their advice. I mean, we already see from the direction, it's fascinating, the two people he chose Reince Priebus, who's the RNC chair, as chief of staff. That's the guy who actually controls the schedule. Steve Bannon as this special advisor guy, which is kind of like the Svengali in your ear that will, help you out. Who will have more power? I don't know. Steve Bannon, his site, has wanted to take Paul Ryan down for months, has said that he's this like crazy open borders, illegal amnesty guy who was trying to work to get Hillary Clinton elected. And Reince Priebus is best friends with Paul Ryan, like from Wisconsin. They know each other really well. How does that work out between the two of them? I think something the President Obama said rings true, hopefully, in that Donald Trump is pragmatic. And if he is a business guy and he wants to get things done, he's going to have to, reach some more pragmatic solutions. And that might be going back on some of his campaign promises, but maybe that's what we'll see going forward. And I do think that we, this is the president, and we need to give him the benefit of the doubt. We'll still be covering him very, very hard and true, but we got to see what his actions are. Appointing Steve Bannon, that's making a lot of people nervous. I've covered Steve Bannon extensively. This guy is, I don't know if he would get hired at like a regular investment bank, just based off his history, but he clearly has built a successful, or helped build a successful media empire. Fun fact, a lot of his wealth comes from owning a part of Seinfeld, so every time you're watching Seinfeld, he gets money from it. He used to be in Hollywood, but we'll see what he can do. I actually now need to step out. I'm very sorry.
Before you do,
Yeah.
if you could take one more minute,
Yeah.
because I wanted to follow up. The question that you're asking, Hollis, goes to the look and the feel of a Trump presidency. What's the cabinet going to look like? What is the Supreme Court going to look like? What's the presidency going to look like? Another factor that we should consider is whether there's going to be a White House press corps. And there is some indication that there's not going to be a White House press corps in a Trump presidency. Do you think that's really a possibility, Hadass, any of you? And furthermore, does it matter?
I think that there will be a White House press corps, and the Trump press secretary has said that eventually they will have a traditional protective pool that follows the president around. Right now, there is not one, so we are doing it kind of haphazardly by ourselves, organizing ourselves and trying to figure out where he is at any one time. I think there will be one. Donald Trump craves attention. I bet he'll be walking into that press room all the time to talk to the media, more so than any other president. However, I won't be surprised if every now and again he'll blacklist a group. Politico was blacklisted for months at a time from attending any Trump campaign events. We had our reporters kicked out even when they just went in as general members of the public. They once patted down a Washington Post reporter to make sure he didn't have his cell phone on him or a computer on him so that he couldn't report from the campaign. And I'm sure that that will happen, something like that will happen again, but he'll never remove the entire media. His first interview wasn't with Breitbart, it was with 60 Minutes. He still craves that approval that comes from the New York Times. Why do you think he spends all day tweeting about how much the New York Times gets him wrong? Why is he wasting his time on that? Because he cares what they say about him. And he knows that he needs that attention. He knows, the guy is a media genius. He knows how to work it and how he needs it. So you'll never see them banned, but you'll see them making it really difficult for the media. And it doesn't necessarily matter because oftentimes the best stories come from outside the White House and not from inside the White House.
I want to toss that question to Brian, too, because you guys at AP cover him extensively. What has been AP's relationship with Donald Trump?
It's been Access has been difficult. We have been tough with him in terms of calling him on when his statements are untrue. It's not a question of opinion. It's a question of whether those are facts or not facts, and we've called him on them when it isn't. We have not been directly punished in the way that some other media organizations have been. I think he and his campaign have sometimes conflated the opinion pages of news organizations with the people who are actually covering the campaign day to day. We don't do opinion. We don't have an opinion page. We don't really have that kind of baggage. So I think in a way that helps us a little bit. But Hadass right at the end made a really, really great point, which is that the best coverage of any administration doesn't usually come from the White House press corps. We need that kind of access. It's really important for the people to know what their president is doing day to day, but there are lots of other ways to cover an administration and to hold them accountable, and that runs the gamut from the Freedom of Information Act to investigative reporting to developing sources in the agencies within the executive branch. So there's a lot of ways to do that, and I think that whether or not there is a White House press corps, I think she's right, there probably will be one, but that we're going to have to really ramp up all of those other efforts, because no matter what, it's not really going to be everything that we're looking for in terms of access to the presidency that we've enjoyed in the past.
I think when Bill Clinton was a candidate, he went on the Arsenio Hall show and played the saxophone. And then a couple of times during his presidency, he would do those shows. I think Obama took it to the next level by appearing on practically all of them. I don't think there's one he didn't.
Slow jamming the news.
Yeah, slow jamming the news, The View, The Talk, The Chew, all of those things.
But he didn't do interviews.
Yeah.
Well, that was it. That was where I was going.
Obama
That was his way of getting out of those
Obama's been the worst
interviews.
president for press access.
Yes,
Terrible.
unquestionably. Yeah.
Terrible.
Can we talk about what there will be? Because we don't know if there will be a press corps like the one we've had. We know that there will be the president tweeting. we know that he's going to keep tweeting. I mean, POTUS, you can follow POTUS. Barack Obama's not tweeting for POTUS. Right? Barack Obama's staffers are tweeting, very carefully constructed messages, and they're all good. Trump is going to appeal directly to his base as president through Twitter. And I don't think that there's any sign so far that he's going to take a different tone or a different tag than he did when he was a candidate. Also, we talk about Bannon coming from Breitbart. Bannon didn't just come from Breitbart. Bannon turned Breitbart into a mouthpiece for the Trump campaign and then became the campaign CEO. Mm-hmm. So he ran a pro-Trump agitprop blog, effectively. He managed to insinuate himself into the top position running the campaign. Now he's going to be in the White House, and his name is still on top as executive chairman. So, he's probably not going to stop communicating with Breitbart. We don't know how in control he'll be, but for the first time, we're going to have something like a state-run media enterprise. Let's just face it. Breitbart is going to be the first effectively state-run media enterprise in the United States. And I think that that's the part that we can't afford to ignore. And I think in some ways, focusing on some of the more quotidian or traditional or comfortable parts of what's happening. Will there be a press corps? Will he do interviews for 60 Minutes? It's almost like missing the forest for the trees. It's not going to be an access problem. It's going to be a narrative problem. It's going to be.
Is that Breitbart itself, or is it the echo chamber that is everyone's Facebook page, because you follow who you want to follow and dismiss what you want to dismiss? I mean, I think Breitbart then ought to be required viewing for the entire country, along with the New York Times. I mean,
well, but call it what it is. I mean, I think Ben's making a great case. It's a propaganda. If it's a propaganda agency, call it a propaganda agency.
It's going to be terrible.
Very little fact-based reporting on Breitbart, if any. And I think we need to be really honest with people that that's what it is. But it's a different version. It's a more overt version of the same tactic that the Obama administration has been using and that the Bush administration used before them, is that using social media as a way to, quote unquote, speak directly to the constituencies cuts out any opportunity to fact check those assertions, to provide context, to do all the things that journalists actually do. It's not a substitute. I mean, it's fine. It is what it is. But the Obama White House distributes these photos every day. We don't use them. We don't distribute them because they always project this heroic image of the president, and you never get any real images of what the president's actually doing, and that's because there's no reason for them to present that. They can present whatever image they want. And so what Trump's doing is really a different version of that, right? It's basically, I have 24 million followers or whatever the number is. I can tell them whatever they want, but let's not confuse the fact that that is not the same as holding your elected officials up to scrutiny. It's not the same thing. And if Breitbart becomes what you're saying, I think you make a great point that that's what Breitbart could end up being.
That's what
And I think we
Breitbart
need to call it what it is. Yeah, we need to call it what it is.
It's already that.
It's not, Breitbart News is a misnomer. It's a propaganda organ for a certain political point of view.
I think, not to raise panic, but I think it already is that. And that's what I think the real fear comes from, is not that a guy with colorful views, to be charitable, has the ear of the president, is that guy also runs the #1 opinion site on the internet that commands a loyal following of people who feel no responsibility to be civil, to hear alternative viewpoints. And really the tone and tenor of Breitbart is not normal. Right? The tone and tenor of Breitbart is irrevocably wed to things that have grown on the internet, like Gamergate, which I don't think really the American body politic understands. I think people who understand Gamergate are young people who spend time on the internet and can track what all these gossipy things are on blogs. Gamergate is almost impossible for me to describe. Maybe you guys can help.
No. Pass.
I'm going to try, because I think this is one of those things that, if you want to understand the alt-right and you want to understand, why Breitbart is such a scary thing. Gamergate was a stupid thing that started almost without any trigger, which is there was a spat between someone on a gaming blog, like a video gaming blog, and the journalist was covering it, but it was really about misogyny. And it almost doesn't matter how it started, because it metastasized into a 2 million strong online mob of misogynists. So Google it, #Gamergate. And I'm sure that young women here have had run-ins with it. I don't want to ask anybody to raise their hand, but I'm sure that young women have attracted this mob, and it's a mob, right? I'm sure that they've tweeted something and have gotten 30 or 40 hate tweets. And a lot of the same people that make up Gamergate are also part of this Breitbart thing, of this alt-right thing. And what we need is good data and reporting to paint it, because it's a growing hate mob on the internet. And Bannon geniusly leveraged the hate mob and created a platform for it. So it has origins in all of these things, and now it's totally legitimized and will in some ways be the mouthpiece for the president. And that's the thing that we need to break through and explain. I mean, that is scary. You're not supposed to have hate mobs. You're not supposed to have weaponized hate mobs. And you're certainly not supposed to have the President of the United States deploying weaponized hate mobs. We don't even know what we're in for.
Got a question back here?
So I'd actually like to go back a little, if I can, to the discussion on millennials. As someone who does some political talk radio on our station here, I've been following the election really since early on in the primaries. And the one saying that I kept coming across in my research was, Democrats want to fall in love with their candidates, Republicans want to fall in line. And as still a Bernie supporter, I fell in love with Bernie, just like many other millennials did. I eventually did bite the bullet and vote Hillary, but I was never excited about it. And I think part of the reason for that was because over the summer we had all these leaked emails showing some sort of cooperation between the Clinton campaign and the DNC and the media. Do you think that the media might have underestimated the impact of those leaked emails, especially the ones that showed some sort of collusion, the impact on the millennial vote?
Well, I mean, what is the media, though? I think one of the things we're hitting on here is that the media is ever more disparate and atomized, and the notion that the media all gets together and decides what to do with Hillary Clinton's emails is, that just doesn't happen. I mean, you kind of have to look at each individual segment of the media as an independent thing. And some certainly did, and others probably made way too big a deal out of it. I mean, certainly Breitbart made a lot of hay out of it. Breitbart is not a news organization, but it certainly is part of the media. But I always bristle at the notion that the media is this monolithic thing that moves in a large pack from like one story to the next, because the reality is that may have been the case 50 years ago, but it is a very complex beast now that includes every possible political persuasion. You have niche media covering every different ethnic group in the country. You've got the so-called mainstream media, which runs the gamut from Fox News to the Huffington Post. and they're all pursuing a different agenda and making different decisions about what to cover. I don't think, we talked about this earlier. I mean, I don't think we can prove it, but it seems like the emails had some impact, and certainly the FBI's review of the emails seems to have had some impact. I don't think we can say that definitively, but I don't think whether or not the media writ large covered that or not. I think that's less of a factor. I think it really depends on what you're talking about, what you use in terms of media as to whether you were provided with one set of information on that or something else.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that we have seen with this election that's really scary and should scare everyone is that people also believed things that were completely fictional, right? At least there was some basis in reality to the whole WikiLeaks Clinton email thing. John Podesta had emails. They were taken and distributed by WikiLeaks. People reported on them. Many more people, statistics show, based on the number of shares and likes that they got, passed around stuff that was totally fictional, that had no bearing in reality whatsoever. And that probably had more of an impact ultimately on the outcome of the election than anything that people did on Hillary Clinton's emails.
We should talk about the word emails. And I just want to make a quick point. Emails, such a big story. What do we mean by emails? There's the emails that were subpoenaed from the private email server of Hillary Clinton, right? There's the emails that were hacked from the DNC, and there's the emails that were hacked from John Podesta. So 3 separate email stories. But I bet 99% of people just think that it was the emails thing, right? And so the emails thing becomes a coda for, all this secret, conspiratorial stuff that's being hid, right? How many of you get your news from Reddit? Raise it very, very high. Higher. Only you guys. Okay. Interesting. So I think if you go to Reddit, right, there are communities in Reddit that are pouring over these emails, and it's citizens, right? It's not really the Washington Post or the New York Times, but it's just citizens. Sometimes they're activists, sometimes they're bored and they got nothing better to do. There's something really interesting about that because the publishing model of WikiLeaks changed, right? So of the 3 email scandals, the Podesta one was the WikiLeaks one, right? And what WikiLeaks used to do is partner with news organizations and give them all the emails, and then they would be legitimized because real journalism would happen provided by WikiLeaks. Right. No agency wants to work with WikiLeaks now. It's too shady, he's too shady, everything about it is shady, and for good reason, right? Because this time there were some state actors involved. So no one wants to touch it. Now what they do is they just dump it, right? So they don't scrub it, they don't remove sensitive information, they don't try to get any signal from the noise, they just dump it. And that is bad. Because when you have so much signal, so much noise, you can't actually find the signal, right? How are we to figure out whether there's anything meaningful in these 30,000 emails that have been leaked? There's no way to prove, either way that there's a scandal there that we should care about or not, because there's just so much of it. It's a deluge. It's almost like when you want to hack a service and take it down. In cyber attacks, there's a thing called DDoS, distributed denial of service. And what that basically means is you send millions of computers at one computer and you overwhelm it and take it down. And in a way, this is a DDoS on democracy, because we're getting tens and tens and tens of thousands of emails, and no one can actually process them or make sense of them, even if every newspaper got to work doing investigative journalism. How would the American people, with the limited amount of time they have to pay attention, how would they parse out what's meaningful and what's not?
And remember all the other information flying out at them at the same time. There's the Access Hollywood tape, there's the debates going on. It's one of about 50 different storylines going on at any given time.
And last point, I think that is intentional. How many John Podesta releases were there? 33, okay? So WikiLeaks could have dumped everything at once, but instead they said, from now on, every 3 days, we're gonna release 5,000 emails. So there were 33 moments where 10,000 emails were released. And what do we do about that? I mean, is that actually good for the debate? Is that actually good for democracy? Is it actually good to know what's happening in the world? It can't be.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left before we wrap up, and I want to ask our panelists to think about the future. Where do we go from here? We spent the last hour looking back and dissecting what happened. I want the panelists to take the last few minutes to talk about what does the future hold. So I want to start with Aaron to kind of look into his crystal ball as we wrap up here tonight and talk a little bit about what you see from your vantage point from broadcast media. You worked at ABC News. It's a different perspective that Brian might offer from print and what the AP does, although we haven't talked about video and the growth of video and what that role has played. But what do you see going forward, Aaron?
Shit, we just spent 18 months getting it wrong, so I got nothing. It would be presumptuous. I think we should just be cognizant of the fact that Donald Trump will do whatever Donald Trump wants. There is, and I don't mean that in like an ultimate cosmic power way, but he has unchecked power in Washington, and he has he values loyalty, but he has no loyalties. He doesn't owe anyone anything. The guy he may have owed the most to, he just kicked out the door in Chris Christie. And so I think he has shown a propensity to do whatever he's into doing at the moment. And I'm not sure that Chuck Schumer is going to put up a stink. He's going to have to pick his battles. So I think it's fascinating to see. Scary to some, hopeful to others, but I don't know that we can know. I don't think in 6 months Steve Bannon has a job. I just don't see how he may be just put him in now, but I don't know that that's tenable. It's gonna be fun to watch.
We're going to do what we do. My job is to report on and scrutinize and hold accountable the people who lead this country, no matter who they are and what party they come from, what their background is, and we're going to do that. But we're going to have to be, I think, smart and creative about how we do it differently. And that may include, what Ben was talking about, the alt-right and the white nationalist movement. Yesterday, the AP created its first white nationalist beat, and we assigned a reporter basically to go deep. And at the same time, we created sort of a liberal America beat. And how will all of the groups that have a political opposition to Trump and Trump's policies try to form some kind of a coalition? Because they all come from different camps and have different perspectives, but if they're going to organize into an opposition, that's got to be happening now, and those conversations need to be happening now. We need to understand what's happening and how that's going. So it's getting back into those communities, finding out whether life got better for all of the people who grasped at Donald Trump as the last hope that might save their communities, and telling the truth about what did and didn't happen there. And we're going to do what we do. We're going to be aggressive, and we're going to be tough, but we're going to be fair and nonpartisan, and we're going to give credit where credit is due. And if nobody's listening, then I guess, it will all be in vain, but I don't know what else to do. I mean, I'm a journalist, and that's what I do. And I feel like the AP has a unique role to play, regardless of which party is in power, to make sure that we're holding them accountable, because we don't have any perspective one way or another in terms of our coverage. So
We're going to cover the weather. I don't know. Honestly, I mean, if you watch television lately, we're going to...
So the thing that I'll be interested to see is whether Donald Trump even wants to live in the White House. There's some reports this week that he's investigating whether he can spend halftime at Trump Tower and halftime at the White House. I think he's probably the only human being for whom sleeping in the West Wing is actually slumming it. So that'll be a fun thing to watch. But on a deeper note, I like to look back at the 80s and a moment where America elected another kind of strange candidate, a guy who was a movie star, right? So Ronald Reagan looked kind of odd to people. When he came to power, they said he was a cowboy, they said he was playing a part, and he did play a part, that a big part of his presidency is now myth, and moments, talking to Gorbachev about tearing down the wall, it's a movie, right? And I think the discourse at that time was Americans understand the world and make sense of the world through television. And if we're in a different place now, it's that Americans make sense of the world through the internet. And whereas television makes you think subconsciously that everything should be entertaining, I think the internet makes you think subconsciously that nothing is true and everything could be possible. And unfortunately, I think it's that enigmatic sense of where we are that will probably come to define the next 4 years. Nothing is true, everything is possible. That's the weird, non-ideological, conspiracy theory embracing, completely unpredictable, highly narcissistic projection style of Donald Trump that I suspect will come to characterize our whole politics.
It's that nothing's true unless it comports with your view, right? That's what the internet sort of
Yeah.
shapes.
I'm hopeful.
Cheery note.
I'm hopeful because this is a country that endured slavery. This is a country that endured a Revolutionary War and a Civil War. And this is a country that has been through a lot. And so as we watch this transition of power from a Democratic president to a Republican one, I'm hopeful that all of those wonderful things that have bound this country together for so many years will come together again and we will move forward. I'm hopeful that a President, Donald Trump, will govern for all the people and not for a few. We have to be hopeful, for that is what America has been built on. I want to thank our distinguished guests for coming out this evening and thank Monmouth University for having us tonight.